Introduce Greg, presenter tonight. The title of his presentation is Backyard Planetary Imaging. Greg is a lifelong amateur astronomer, built his own 8-inch Newtonian telescope at age 13, and he did the hand grinding of the mirror himself, and actually started the planetary photography using this telescope. Greg grew up in Australia, but moved to US and has been living in Denver for the last 15 years. He owns a 8-inch Celestron Edge, as well as ED-102 refractor, doing planetary photography for the last 10 years and getting into deep sky photography as well in the last 2 years. He is, in addition to amateur astronomy, he is an avid traveler, gardener, and into dogs in a big time. Has 2 rescue dogs, both black lab mixes. Also does volunteer work and foster dogs. He's a software engineer for a local company here in Denver, which recently was acquired by an Australian company, and Greg doesn't like it, but that's the case. So Greg, please proceed with your presentation.
Are we recording?
I am recording now. Hold on a second. After this.
On the bottom row, Mehmet, just to the right of share screen. And then you'll have the option to record to your computer or the cloud.
Okay.
There it is.
Please proceed, Greg.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the intro. I'm sorry if I come across a little bit anxious. I'm sick and I'm also a little bit nervous about doing the presentation, so bear with me. I'm going to be reading some of it scripted, and other I'll just do ad hoc as I go through the slides. Tonight I'm going to give quite a high-level overview of planetary photography from your backyard with very simple equipment. I mean, there's many subtopics in planetary photography that are subjects in their own right. And I don't want to go down one of those rabbit holes. I would rather everybody walk away with a broad understanding of the type of equipment you can use, the type of images you can get, my personal workflows, and my general experience with it. As somebody said earlier, the pictures we are getting from our backyards now with 8-inch telescopes rival that of, the 200-inch Mount Wilson. It's just incredible what technology has done in the last 10 years in terms of backyard planetary and deep sky photography. Yeah, I've done this for around 10 years or so, but since I came to the US, I could never afford a Smith Cassegrain in Australia. They were always super expensive. So as soon as I got here, and I saw an 8-inch Celestron for under $1,000, it was mine. So anyway, with that, I will get on with the presentation, and hopefully you get something valuable out of it. Okay, so this is just a very quick overview. I'm not the best planetary photographer out there. There are some amazing people doing amazing work with, all over the world. Some with very big telescopes, others with not so big scopes. But yeah, so my images are nowhere close to the best that people are producing, but they're not too bad, really, given my level of involvement with it. Planetary photography is what it is. It's the capture of many thousands, in fact, individual frames in the form of a video. So you use a telescope, obviously, and a CMOS planetary camera and some simple capture software That video then gets processed with free software and can produce a final image. And we'll get into all this as I go through it. With planetary photography, aperture is king. The bigger your aperture, the more detail you are going to get. But you don't need to rush out and buy a Celestron 14 or anything like that. You can get good results with a 6-inch telescope. And sometimes it's better off to start with a smaller one. The issues you will often have are not quite as exaggerated as with the bigger telescopes. I did have an 11-inch Celestron, which I got rid of simply because the thing was so damn heavy, and I would only use it a couple of times a year when the planets were up, and it really wasn't worth it for me. So I've gone back to a C8. I will only be dealing with CMOS color cameras, one-shot color, simply because monochrome is a whole different game and it involves filters and a lot more complex processing. I'm not going to get into that tonight. So all the images taken on this are mine, for whatever that's worth. They were taken with a C8 and some with the C11 before I got rid of it. A ZWO-244 planetary camera, and the deep sky image was taken with my ED102 refractor and the ZWO-533 deep sky camera. I will get into the basic differences between the two types of cameras as we go through the presentation. All right, so the differences, I'll quickly run through the differences. Planetary is lucky imaging, where you take hundreds of thousands of individual sub-second images in the form of a video. Deep sky is precise imaging, where you take multiple long exposure images anywhere from 30 seconds to 10 minutes or longer. Planetary is greatly affected by atmospheric turbulence or seeing. Deep sky is affected more by light pollution and to a lesser extent atmospheric turbulence. Planetary, now here's the good thing with planetary if you're just starting out, you don't require precise tracking or guiding, and you don't necessarily have to have an equatorial mount or polar alignment to take photographs. Obviously, if you mount tracks, it's a great help, but it's not necessary. Whereas deep sky requires precise guiding with an equatorial mount and obviously very precise polar alignment. Planetary, you can get away with minimal software and processing requirements. In fact, you can do your processing with one program if you really want to. And it's a good way to start to get an understanding of the processing, the process. Whereas deep sky is complicated capture software, complicated and multiple packages to stack and process your images, as well as requiring calibration images and a whole swag of things. So I'm kind of glad I started my journey with planetary, because had I gone down the deep sky route, I probably would have thrown my telescopes on the compost heap long ago. The planetary CMOS cameras, they're relatively cheap and don't require cooling, whereas the deep sky cameras are typically upwards of $1,000. They do require cooling, correct spacing, and a PhD in physics to try and understand them and make them work. So that's just a quick overview of the differences. All right, hardware. So at the very minimum, you are going to need, obviously, a telescope. It doesn't matter what sort of telescope, and I've just put up some random pictures off the internet here. You're going to need a mount of some sort. It can be an equatorial mount, an alt-azimuth mount, whether it tracks or not, it doesn't matter. You're going to need a CMOS/CCD type dedicated astro camera. CCD cameras aren't particularly common anymore. They came out when this hobby started taking off. You can still get them. Celestron has one, which is very cheap. You can pick it up for under $100. And that's how I started. It was a good way to start. You'll need a computer with a USB 2 port and lots of storage space. And I can't emphasize the storage space enough. Now, ideally, you're going to want a telescope with an aperture of 8 inches or more, typically a Newtonian, Dobsonian, Schmidt-Cassegrain. A CMOS camera specifically designed for planetary photography. The difference between the deep sky cameras and the planetaries are capable of obtaining far higher frame rates. So depending on your setup, your planetary camera can get up to 300 to 400 frames a second. which is a lot of data. Whereas your deep sky isn't designed for that. Your deep sky cameras typically, I think, can get up to about 50 frames, but they have a whole different function. So the idea of the planetary ones is that you'll get the highest frame rate you can possibly get. And I'll explain why in a little bit. You will need an IR UV cut filter. Some cameras do come with them built in. This is something I didn't realize, and I couldn't understand why my images initially were really bad. And of course, the camera is sensitive to IR UV, whereas my eyes weren't. And so I wouldn't see the IR UV light being captured until I process. And then, of course, it focuses differently to red, green, blue. And so I would have all this fuzzy stuff around the edges from the infrared and ultraviolet. You're going to want to mount the tracks fairly accurately. Again, that can be alt-azimuth or equatorial. It just simplifies the workload. That's all it is. You can get by. There's one guy in Florida who I follow. He takes the most amazing planetary pictures, and he's got a 16-inch Dobsonian that's not tracked. And he's one of the best photographers out there that I've seen. And but it does simplify your workload. Now, another thing, again, as I said earlier, aperture is king, so is magnification. So typically a 2 times or higher Barlow lens is required. What a Barlow does, a Barlow will effectively, or 2 times one will double the focal length. So an 8-inch Schmidt-Cassegrain, for example, like this one, will have, I think it's got a 2400 millimeter focal length. Putting on a 2 times Barlow lens onto this will double the focal length to 48. And that increases your magnification significantly. Again, it's got to be within the constraints of your telescope. You can't go putting a 5 times, they're available, you can't, but a 5 times Barlow lens, for example, you wouldn't go sticking that on an 8-inch telescope. It's beyond the telescope's capabilities, and you'll just bring yourself grief. So typically a 2 times is a good one to start with. Alrighty, software. Everything is software driven these days, as we know. So at the very minimum, you need Sharp Cap or Fire Capture. Both these are 100% free for planetary use. And you would need this software called Registack 6. I'll get into what each of these does on the next slide. Ideally, you're going to need Sharp Cap or Fire Capture. I use Sharp Cap, and that's just simply a familiarity thing where I've used it all along. I like and I'm comfortable with it. There's this thing called Auto Stack It, and I will explain what that does. It's pretty much a necessity, and it is the go-to standard for everybody. Then again, we've got this Registack 6, and then some sort of Photoshop type software to process your final images. I use a free one called GIMP. It doesn't matter what you use. You can, if you're a Photoshop expert, you can use Photoshop. This is just what I use. All right, so what is the software used for? Oops, sorry. So Sharp Cap and Fire Capture will simply, what they will do, they will connect to your camera. They will allow the capture of images through your telescope with a broad range of settings and parameters. And this is just an example screenshot of a capture I did of Jupiter maybe about a month ago, just a still shot. And I'm not going to go into the depth into the parameters. I will explain some of them and the critical ones. But this was actually a pretty good night. That's not a bad image to see on your capture. The next program is Auto Stack It. Now, what Auto Stack It does, when you take a video, the next thing you need to do is process that video. And what Auto Stack It does, it will go through that video. And now we're talking sometimes here, you might have 30 or 40,000 individual frames. Auto Stack It will go through those, analyze them, and sort them in the order from best to worst. It'll then allow you to stack, say, you might want to say, I only want to stack the best 25% of my images, and it will do that based on its sorting. And what that will do, Auto Stack It will then give you a final processed image, which isn't very good. You then need to clean it up with Registacks. And where Registack shines is it's what's called wavelet manipulation or image manipulation. It allows you to to bring out the fine detail, to sharpen, to reduce noise, and, you know, end up with somewhat of a pleasing final image. And then you can do your finishing touches in your Photoshop type programs. Now, one of the things that I just want to make clear, I don't mention auto stack it here in a minimum, and that the reason for that is that Registack 6 actually will do that initial processing of the video, sorting the images from best to worst, and then letting you stack a certain percentage or a certain number of frames. However, auto stacking is considered far superior in it, so most people tend to use this rather than using the stacking part of Registack 6. All right, so the concept of lucky imaging. It's called lucky imaging for one simple factor. As everybody knows, you know, if you look up and you're looking out through the atmosphere, the stars twinkle. And that's because of atmospheric turbulence, and it wreaks havoc on our planetary images. It's like being at the bottom of a pool looking out. There's a scale, I'll put a picture of the scale down the bottom. It's kind of an arbitrary scale, but it's basically based on the resolution in arc seconds, and the higher the number, I believe, the worse the scene. But lucky imaging comes from the capture process where, and using this image here, this is a live image of Jupiter being captured. And if you look at that image, it goes from blurry to sharp to blurry to sharp. And meanwhile, we are capturing that at probably 200 frames a second. And the lucky imaging comes in is that hopefully of those 20,000 images we capture, that some percentage of them are actually going to be the fraction of a second where the image was sharp. And that's where the concept of the lucky imaging comes from. So yeah, that's why it's called lucky imaging, and it is very lucky imaging. Denver is notorious for bad seeing. We had a couple of days this year, I think it's the best seeing I've ever had, or I've ever seen in Denver in 15 years, but Denver is just notorious because of the mountains, because of the heat. It can be quite frustrating, especially when you don't get a lot of clear nights, or the planets are up in the middle of winter and it's not very pleasant being outside when it's 20 below. Now, here's some examples of seeing. Again, these are all through my telescopes. So this is bad seeing. The first one is Mars. Now, if you look at this one, you will see the main features like the polar caps and the darker areas here actually pretty much disappear at points. I mean, and if I went out and had a night like that, I wouldn't be bothered imaging, because your final images will be just as bad. Then we have average seeing, which is probably typical of what we get in Denver, and it's not too bad. Saturn is looking pretty good. The Cassini division stays pretty sharp throughout the video. The big downside on this kind of seeing, which we get all the time, is the way the planet blobs. And the problem with that is that's difficult for the programs to stack and align when you're doing your processing. So, but you know, that's not too bad, and you'll see some results in a minute of what I get from this sort of image. And then here's an example of good seeing, you know, and what you notice with the good seeing is the frequency of the vibration of the planet is very high, rather than this blobby effect. And all the images, all the features on the planet stay pretty sharp. All right, I'm going to run through this reasonably quickly. That's my Celestron 8 Edge. I got that from Mile High Astronomy. Anyway, so to take an image, basically what you need to do, you need to connect your camera's USB cable to your computer's USB port. USB 2 and 3 will work. USB 3 transmits data faster. So if you have this option, always use it. You open the capture software. The software will detect and automatically connect your camera. The software then allows for selection of resolution. You should always start out with the highest resolution. This is determined by the sensor on your camera. And what that does, it makes finding your object and focusing your object much easier. And I'll get into this a little more because it's probably one of the most annoying parts of it, is the getting the object into the capture screen. So you then point your telescope to the target. If your pointing is accurate, the object should appear in the capture window. If not, you may need to manually center the object visually before reinserting the camera. And I'll go over this again because, like I said, it's important. Focus obviously is critical. It also is quite challenging. Simply with, you've got bad seeing and then a scope that vibrates to hell every time you touch the focusing knob. So it takes a little bit of patience and not so much swearing. A lot of my neighbours, I think I have Tourette's because I'm outside swearing. So your target should now be centered and focused in the capture window. You need to adjust, and I'll get into this as well, the region of interest to minimize the black space around the target. You might remember I said on the last screen, open up with your maximum resolution. Well, that's the same as the ROI. So once you've got the image in there, we want to minimize the black space around the object because that black space is data. And if you don't reduce it, what will happen is that'll get transmitted to your computer and that will slow down your frame rate, and it'll do all sorts of things. So, and I'll get an example of that in a minute. You want to adjust your shutter speed and your gain settings that will give you an image that visually looks correct and presents a histogram of about 80%. I'm not going to go into what a histogram is, but it's generally accepted 80% is a good value. Again, this is very subjective to your equipment, what you like, your processing skills. If your histogram is too high, you will burn out the image, the brighter parts of the image. If it's too low, you won't capture enough of it. So it's one of those things you need to experiment with. The ROI, the shutter speed and the gain, they're all intertwined. Gain will increase your brightness of dim objects, but it also increases the noise, meaning that then you will need to take more image to cancel that noise out. And it becomes, you know, anybody who's done deep sky understands the signal to noise ratio, and it applies to planets as well. So typically you need to find a balance between a fairly fast shutter speed that will give you a good frame rate, a reasonably high gain setting that's not going to kill you with noise, and then your ROI to sort of crush everything in a bit to minimize the data transfer. All right, so then you start your capture. The length of the capture is determined by the number of frames taken or by a time parameter. At the end of the capture, you will have a video for processing, if you're lucky. All right, so considerations when you are taking an image. Now, this is a sharp cap control panel over here. And as you can see, there's a lot to it. But in this case, my exposure, this was a Jupiter, so my exposure was 5.15 milliseconds at a gain setting of 356, which is pretty high. However, that gives me the sort of image I can work with. So, but you can fiddle with all of these. All of this stuff can be fiddled with. And this is your capture area as well. This is what I'm talking about, the region of interest. When you come to taking your image, you need to get this down to as small as you can, where it gets your whole target object in there with the minimal black space around it. You need, okay, considerations. You are going to need very, very accurate go-to or find a scope accuracy. If you don't, you're not going to find the image. When you're pointing your telescope at Jupiter or Saturn or whatever it is, it's an amazingly small part of the sky. And to try and get that to appear into the center of your capture screen is almost impossible without having very accurate go-to or find a scope accuracy. And this was probably my biggest swear source at the beginning, because I just thought I could point it, you know, with sort of reasonable accuracy and the image would be there. But no, it's not. So do your calibration, your star calibration when you set up, or get your finder scope to where it's pretty accurate. Focus, again, focus obviously what it is. Optimal settings, region of interest, shutter speed, gain, and I've already gone through that. These settings will vary depending on your target, equipment, etc. Jupiter, for example, is a very bright object. So with Jupiter, you can get away with a low gain setting and a low shutter speed, or a fast shutter speed, I should say. And whereas Saturn is a couple of magnitudes duller, and so it requires a little bit more tweaking to get that nice balance of, you know, not too much noise and all that sort of thing. Now, the seeing conditions on the night of the shooting, of course, again, it comes down to seeing. The more the twinkly the stars, the worse the seeing. And how high the sky is in the target also impact the quality of your image. And at the moment, as you all probably know, the planets are down pretty low. I think they're at about 35, Jupiter maybe 40, which is pretty low. So you're shooting through thicker atmosphere. And it's going to be that way for some time to come. All right, so I'll run through this quickly because I've done some of them. So tips for better images. Focus. I cannot emphasize the focus. You need a solid mount to minimize your vibrations. You need to let your equipment equalize with the ambient air temperature. If you do not, you'll set up your own little mini weather system in your telescope and it will be the worst turbulence you've ever seen. So for an 8-inch telescope, it probably should sit outside for about an hour to equalize with the ambient air temperature. Get the fastest possible shutter speed. The faster, the more likely you're going to get lucky and you're going to capture one of those images in that fleeting second where it's actually sharp. And again, I've already gone through this through the region of interest. So the camera I use, my plane with the ZWO-244, can get up to 300 frames per second with Jupiter, depending on conditions on the night and a few other things. But that's a lot of, when you think about that, that's a lot of frames. Seeing, again, you can't control the seeing. Now, here's the other one, of course. There's always something. Object rotation. All the planets rotate. Jupiter and Saturn rotate pretty quickly, I think about 10 hours. So what that unfortunately will do, it limits the amount of time you can capture a video for. Because if you capture for longer than whatever that period is, I think for Jupiter it's about 2.5 minutes, the Jupiter will move. It's rotating, and so you will end up with a smeared image. Saturn's a little bit more forgiving because of the type of data on the type of details you'll see on Saturn. There is software available that will de-rotate images. So what people will do, they will take 10 2.5-minute videos, for example, then de-rotate them with the software. But that's complicated. I'm not going to go into that tonight. So when you first start out, you've got to be, you can't just sit there and open up your camera for 10 minutes on Jupiter because you'll just end up with a big blurred mess. So, all right, so this is what a sharp cap looks like in sharp cap. And I took both of these. They're not very good videos, I'm sorry, though. I use my phone. So in this one, Jupiter is at 640 by 480, which is about the size I can fit it in comfortably. And this is what I'm talking about with the region of interest. So I've got minimal black space, and as you can see, it was actually a pretty good night. There's actually some quite substantial detail that I can see there on Jupiter. Now, and for some reason, I don't know why that night, the frame rate, I was only getting 112 frames per second. I'm not sure why. I think when I look back, I had reset all my sharp cap settings. And so I think I'd reset my maximum USB rate. So it resulted in a slower speed. Now then we've got Saturn. Now Saturn is a lot duller. So if you look, what have we got here? See, Saturn here is actually 43 microseconds. So that's a pretty long exposure. And this is full frame. And I just did this simply as an example. I would not normally shoot it at full frame like this because all this black space is just data that you don't want. And it will just slow everything down and make your processing go forever. All right, so then that same image of Jupiter, what I did, I then put that video through Auto Stack at 3. As you can see here, and you get a quality graph here, which I'm not going to explain, but it gives you an idea of the quality of your individual images. I then stacked those images using this. And this was the partial result. Now, it doesn't look very good. It's blown up quite large on the screen. But as you can see, you've gone from kind of a blurry, fuzzy, stacked image now to a reasonably sharp image with quite a lot of detail. And this is my final result on this on 8/25. So this is what the image looks like when it comes out, when the video gets processed and the top 50% or whatever are stacked. This is what you end up with, something that looks like this. And then with a little processing and a little tweaking, you can end up with an image like that. And I mean, this has actually got quite a bit of detail on it. I mean, to get the black thing in the middle of the great red spot's quite unusual. Again, this is blown up way bigger than I normally would just for the presentation, so it looks a little bit grainy. But I was actually pretty pleased with that image. It turned out quite well. And I don't know how many of you look at people's images online, but people are actually quite regularly now getting details on the moons, which, when you think about it, it's pretty amazing. This is from the same night where I did Saturn. Now, this was kind of hurried. So this is the raw stack, this image that came out of auto stack it, and then with some hurried processing. And I don't know why I put this one up. I don't like the color, but it was actually a pretty good night. It's hard to imagine that from this, you can actually pull out this sort of detail. And that's the beauty of the software. And with a little bit more care, I could probably end up with an even nicer image. And here's the same image again, with some differences in the way of processing. And as you can see, you can change it, color it however you want. And I personally like the right-hand one. I think that's a far more pleasing and somewhat accurate. The colors might be a little bit exaggerated, and you can even make out the hexagon just slightly. So, but the processing comes down to personal taste, and the diehards will always try and do it so that it's as accurate to real life color as possible. But it just comes down to what you like and what you want the final image to look like. So I'll give you some final thoughts. Patience. This is a very rewarding but exceptionally frustrating hobby. It's got multiple moving parts and so many combinations and permutations of how to do things. It can be overwhelming, but don't be put off. So just to give you an example, 10 years ago, these top two images of Saturn and Jupiter were my very first ever pictures of Jupiter and Saturn. And I was ecstatic about them. If you look at them now, they look like crap. But these were taken with a C8, admittedly not the camera I've got now, Next Image 5, which is a cheap camera, but, it's kind of not very good. And then, with a bit of practice and some improvement and a lot of luck, I started getting a little bit more detail to whereas today, these are probably my better images that I have taken from my backyard. So it's just a matter of, it's a matter of getting out there and playing and realize you're going to be frustrated. You are going to be frustrated, but it's a fun hobby, and it's really, and like I said, I mean, these images here, these are amazing for an 8-inch telescope from a backyard in Denver. Really, I mean, when you think about the 200-inch telescope at Mount Wilson, I think it is, or the Palomar, the images were nothing like this, and it just amazes me. And yeah, so I have some useful links here where you can get all your software, and all the software I've given you the software is all free. Sharp Capitals have a paid option, but that is for polar alignment. You don't need it for planetary photography. So everything else is 100% free, and it's it's a good resource. And there's a ton of YouTube tutorials out there, so you can go through and find people and see their particular methods and their recommendations. It's you can be watching YouTube videos probably for the rest of your life, as I found out. But it's all good fun. And that I'm afraid is it. So I hope everybody enjoyed it. I hope you got something from it. It's a bit hard to know what to tell people while trying to keep it high level, but I hope you've got an idea of what you need if you wanted to get started in taking planetary photos.
Okay, I'm going to stop the